So, just a huge pleasure to introduce Christian, and just to say that I think we've been part of a journey that goes back a long time. I was very aware and enjoyed your book around Salisbury, and now, of course, the issue of architecture and cultural continuity, which has just come out, which I've looked at and read quite a lot of. And I'm a huge fan of your work on Florence. I think that mapping is extraordinary, amazing. And I think indeed all the photographs, so many of the photographs that are yours, and the diagrams that are so explanatory take you beyond the world of the normal kind of art historical dialogue into something that's much more approachable, and importantly so from an architectural perspective. So I think then you've also quoted one of our former lecturers here, Tony Travis, in terms of London, which I think is going to be the focus of tonight, which is fascinating. We tend to ignore the place we exist in, and it's certainly worthy of the same scrutiny, I believe. So, Christian, thank you. We'll have questions and answers after this, and I look forward to those, because I'm sure there are going to be many. Thank you.
Okay, so I am going to be talking about London today, but mostly around this image, and it's painted. It's actually a copy of a painting that was painted around 1550, 3 years after the coronation of Edward VI, who's here. And what I'm going to be talking about is what you should take away from a painting like this. It's high Renaissance to a certain extent in its time, but it looks slightly more crude. But let's start off with the title. So Janus faces. So what is Janus faces? Well, here's the god Janus, and it's commonly understood beginnings, gates, transitions, time, duality, doorways, passages, frames, and endings. It's often used by people saying, oh, I'm looking both ways, but it's much more complex. It has a temporal basis to the god. And also, what's very interesting, here's a quote from Plutarch here.
The first month, January, is so named from Janus, and I think that March, which is named from Mars, was moved by Numa, this is around about the same time as Romulus and Remus, from its place at the head of the months, because he wished in every case that martial influences should yield precedence to civic and political. For this, Janus, in remote antiquity, whether he was a demigod or a king, was a patron of civil and social order, and is said to have lifted human life out of its bestial and savage state. For this reason, he is represented with two faces, implying that he brought men's lives out of one sort of condition and into another. He also a temple of Rome with double doors, which they call the gates of war, for the temple always stands open in a time of war, but is closed in a time of peace. So Janus is really not who you thought he was in terms of the idea about what it means to quote Janus in something like this, and particularly in England, just after the Reformation. Literally, we have a challenging period that's going on well through the time of Elizabeth and the Gunpowder Plot, 1605. So it's a time of war and conflict, and what Edward and what these types of processions are doing is trying to bring some sort of civic order to something otherwise a little bit more dangerous in terms of the ground. So what we're going to be looking at today is scale, perspective, urban order based around processions, but also the transition to a new civic order. The processional moment as a transition marked on the ground through the city, illustrated in a picture. So the question is, what is this a representation of? Is it a representation of London, or is it a representation of the king, or is it a representation of the civic order of London manifested by the guilds? And it's actually probably a bit of all of those things, which is why it's slightly strange perspective. It was commissioned by Sir Anthony Browne, who was the Master of Horse under Henry VIII. This is in his castle, Cowdray House, which he inherited around 1542, so about 5 years before the coronation. And in fact, he was very close to the king, and he rode to pick up Edward VI and to Elizabeth, and processed into the city soon after the death of Henry VIII and proclaimed the king. So he's already very close in the procession order of the world in terms of the City of London. So let's just, for those of you who don't know the history, this is one of the ways I do my history, just to make some architectural links to what we're talking about. So here's Edward. The Reformation is around here, but we're still only we still haven't got the Thomas Cranmer prayer book. It's still not actually cemented massively into the Church of England. But in terms of architecture, what we've got here is these are the treatises that have been printed around this time. And what's interesting is, although we have Alberti's De Edificatoria in 1486, it's not translated into English until 1726. So all of the people who are understanding of this are reading, or have a European tradition. They're reading foreign languages. And someone like de Vries, Vredeman de Vries's work is coming over mostly through workmen in stuff like strap work, stone carvers. So we have that, but we also have these types of influences. We're going to talk about Pietro Torrigiano in a little bit. He was a mate of Michelangelo until they had a big fight, and he broke his nose. So those pictures of Michelangelo with a squash nose, this is the guy who did it, and he had to leave Florence soon after. And he came over to the court. So he was at the court from about 1507 onwards, and then he died in Spain, actually. But what I'm trying to do by doing this is telling you that there's influences and knowledge of some of this work, but it's not necessarily obvious yet. It hasn't been taken on board. And if we look at something like the architecture of England at the time, Somerset House, we're still not in the place where we've got the Whitehall banqueting, the Inigo Jones world that begins the classical introduction. But what we do have is, through things like these workmen coming through with an understanding of this, in work that we know of Robert Smithson, Woollerton and Hardwick, these are beginning to have some classical influences. And Smithson, the reason why I start with him is because he was a stonemason at Longleat, which looked like this. So this is what the architecture looked like around about the time that we're talking about in that painting. It's not a castle, it's Janus-faced, it's looking potentially more like a villa. It's moving towards a more civic understanding of a building. It's what the English might have developed further if we hadn't taken the European treatises so literally a bit later on with someone like Inigo Jones. We can see quite a few of the England prodigy houses and the Jacobean houses before that happened in this world. We have some classical influence, but it's not, and we can see some of the orders, but equally it has the echoes of a castle as well. It has an echo of the past. So these are the other. There's 5 paintings that were painted in this house, most of which were related to the work or the stuff that was done with Anthony Browne had done with Henry VIII. And what we're looking at here, I think, is it's not a Where's Wally picture, although it does have that sort of feeling. But there's things going on in here which I think is really interesting. Clearly, he would have known there's little incidents, little things going on in here. So it's a very narrative drawing. It's not one thing going on. It has a bit like a tapestry, one of those things where there may be an overall picture, but when you come up close to a tapestry, the millefeuille is about recognizing the surface of the tapestry. So we have in here this sort of narrative strangeness where we've got simultaneity of all of these things that would have happened sequentially happening at the same time. There's very clearly a recognizable landscape, which would have been the highlights of that landscape, and some recognizable architecture, which would probably mean that you could recognize Calais buildings. We're going to do that for London a bit more, but you can see there's stuff going on which is very clear. Rain and fire, it's quite crude, I think, in terms of what's going on, but very clearly we've got little tales going on in here. This is a bust of Henry VII, who was the patron of Torrigiano when he came, and this is the sculpture by Torrigiano of Henry VII. So it was commissioned by Henry VIII when he was in England. But also, just to give you a little bit more of that link as well, Machiavelli, who was writing, and many people think that Henry VII's court was incredibly Machiavellian. He didn't read it because The Prince was written afterwards. Nevertheless, what we're looking at is a political culture which is Machiavellian pretty much across Europe, certainly in England as well. And this is what Machiavelli had to say about Henry VIII. Rich, fierce, and greedy for glory. So he fits pretty clearly into what you would expect in that. So again, what I'm trying to talk about is the sense of this sort of European culture that's being represented in these very complex paintings that were painted in the main hall of the castle of his house. And these were etchings taken from the paintings, and the house burnt down, Albury House burnt down. So these are the only surviving remnants of that work. But in this one, for example, I'm sorry about the quality. This is Portsmouth. So here's the Mary Rose about to sink with the French, gathering off the coast of. This is a long time before we became good sailors. We weren't very good at this point. Anyway, but you can see the forts, and so the landscape is recognizable. Someone who knows that would have recognized the key points. And here's the full picture of the coronation procession, which was in February. It's the day before the coronation, in fact. And this is the same happened for Mary after, and for Elizabeth. They stay in the Tower of London. They process through the streets, particular streets of London, and this is the day before his coronation. His coronation is on the 20th of February, 1547. The day before, he processes from there to Westminster via Charing Cross, and we'll go through some of the elements at the moment in a moment. But it's very clear. You can see it's from the north. We've got Southwark over here. This is St Mary Overy Priory, probably only very recently sold to someone through the Court of Augmentations after the dissolution in around 1539. So it's less than 10 years ago. A lot of this stuff wouldn't have been yet modified in a particular way, and there would have been still a lot of people in this area who would have been lamenting the loss of this world that he's talking about. We've got the Tower of London through the middle tower, which is very clearly established here. It's the only way out of the tower at this point. Past St Mary Le Bow, what appears to be St Mary Le Bow, and through Cheapside. Now I've got a little bit of this is the account at the time. I'll just read a bit of it. I won't do it all. The streets were well gravelled in every place, and from Gracechurch Street to the little conduit in Cheap, rails were fixed to one side, within which stood the crafts in their order, aldermen being at the termination of the line by the little conduit. On the other side of the streets, in many places, were stationed priests, clerks, with their crosses and censers and their best ornaments, to sense the king. And throughout all the way, on either side, the houses were garnished with cloths of tapestry, arras, cloth of gold, and cloth of silver, with cushions of the same, and streamers and banners as richly as might be devised. The king left the tower about 1 in the afternoon, and the order of procession was as follows. And there's pages. Okay, so I can tell you, I mean, I'm not going to recognize all of them, but this is the beginning of the procession. And you go through here, there's page 2. And then the king has capitals in this particular thing. The king is here. And behind him is Sir Anthony Browne, the very man who commissioned the painting. The master of horse sits just behind him. 9 henchmen, 9 goodly. We'll go into it. At the conduit at Cornhill was a goodly pageant. So there's pageants going on, which are particularly telling particular stories related to various aspects of what they felt the king wanted to hear. And building on what Tony Travers was talking about, you know, they give him each of these coronations, the city gives 1,000 marks. It's like, come in, show us your stuff, 1,000 marks, now go down to Westminster and leave us alone. There's a sense of the fact that the ordering of this, and here are all of your guildsmen here represented, that they are a part of the city. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But in order to get there, so here's the route. Pretty much is recognised. The same for Elizabeth, very similar to Mary. Coming up through here around Great Church Street, and then along Cheapside, down past St Paul's, out through the gate, and then across down through past Charing Cross we saw, down to the Palace of Westminster. But before we can do that, we need to understand what we understand about art and about the other ways in which processions are particularly represented or have been represented. This is a very famous one. So this is 1563. So it's only 10 years sort of different from what we're talking about. This is in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. A lot of my work, as Eric said, is on Florence. And what I'm going to be taking you through now is a sequence of paintings that talk about, I believe, this representation of Florentine civic order through the processional activity. And the paintings were designed to do that. And then we're going to come back to that London one again. So here's the growth of Palazzo Vecchio. It starts around 1300. The commune itself probably around a century before then. There's some disputed aspects of that, and it grows in order to become the place where the signori are housed for the duration of their 6-month priorate. This is today. It's still a part of their civic representation through their processional order, but at the time, this is painted by Vasari at the time when the civic palace is converting into a ducal palace. But it's already recognizing the processional order that was a part of the civic world prior to that. So you can see in here, it's perspectively relatively accurate. We have the Arno in the foreground. We have here the triumvirate of Julius Caesar, Antony, Augustus, and Lepidus. Here, planting the vexillum, which is the planting of the banner, is the first move. Then they begin to go through the founding rituals. In terms of what we're looking at here, you can see the amphitheatre. Here's the aqueduct. And this is the Temple of Mars, which is what they thought the baptistry was built on top of, with Fiesole in the background, where Catiline was just before the final battles where he lost his life. This bit here is interesting. This is about the rights of the founder. This is, again, from the Roman thing. I think it's a very famous image. I think Joseph has it in the idea of a town. And the right, so the founder moves anti-clockwise around the boundary whilst ploughing the first furrow, locating the sacred boundary or pomerium. The plough pulled by a cow inside and an ox outside. And I can tell you, if you look carefully, you can see that they are in fact gendered. Pulling the plough and lifting it at every gate, defining the limits of a city as templum. Okay, so here's the Roman city. So here's the amphitheatre, which is on the site of where the Palazzo Vecchio becomes. We don't have on the archaeological evidence the Temple of Mars, because that's under the baptistry. These are the other bits that have been, identified. But here you can see what we're interested in is this first furrow here that would have happened, and that at the time, by this time, the first furrow, even when the city expands to much larger, the symbolic refounding of the city is undertaken through this route. It extends over into the southern part of the city, the quartiere of Santo Spirito, but you can see that it's very critical to that. And these are the quartieri. Again, the quartieri are formed when the city grows. Before then, there were smaller boroughs, smaller areas linked to the inside boundary, which was this one. So they extended it out to here. And what's really weird about this, and I want you to sort of remember this map a little bit, all of the ones on this side of the river, all of the gonfaloni, which are these different three colours. So we have the yellow, red, green and blue are the four quarters. Inside those, they each are divided into three. Now they're not divided sensibly, are they? I mean, I think we can actually see that. But what they are doing is ensuring that every one of the gonfaloni has a piece of the procession. That's really what we're looking at here. So the idea, except for when we cross over here, Santo Spirito, which is this church here, has it, but these other three lose out a bit. But it's very clear that what they're trying to do is to get the political structure, the civic structure of the city engaged with the procession. It's not the other way around. The procession leads this political structure. And what's interesting in that is that when we see London, because London is not formed in this way, the processional order in a sense is added later, it doesn't have that same need. But if we're talking about the processional function itself, all of the gangs of men were linked through the gonfaloni. So each of these areas would have had their own livery, funded by a group of businessmen or possibly guilds related to those areas. And they were the ones who then formed the structure of the processions themselves. The parishes really didn't have much to do with that structure. So that's relatively clear. But what we were looking at in that procession emerged a lot earlier. And we're going to talk here, this is a Madonna della Misericordia, and this is a Piero della Francesca painting, much more traditional. The notion that it's the mantle of the Virgin that protects certain people. This is the one in Florence. It's actually in the Loggia de Bigolo. You can see it sort of doesn't quite fit around a fireway here. But what is happening here is that the mantle is protecting the city of Florence. It's not protecting people, it's protecting civitas. What does that mean? This is around about, we can see it's late 13th, early 14th century. We know that the procession was already established by that point, so it's clearly working. So here's a close-up of that city, of the image of Florence. Now, what have we got here? Possibly, you might think, first of all, well, there's a river outside the walls, that must be the Arno. Fair enough. We know this is the baptistry, and this is the Cathedral of Santa Reparata. They hadn't yet begun the Santa Maria della Fiore, and so same position, slightly smaller, but they were redoing the facade. They were putting a nice new facade on it. We can also see here the tower of the Palazzo Vecchio, you might recognise from the earlier slide. Here, this long, tall one here, the Bargello, which was the earlier political building in the city, and the Badia, a part of one of the key churches of the town. What can we say about all of those? Well, they don't actually fit together in that way in reality. Here is the baptistry and everything. So if the Palazzo Vecchio was behind, then they should be the other way around. So, but anyway, let's go through the buildings. So here's the cathedral and the baptistry. Here's the Bargello, and here is and with the Badia opposite, and here is the Palazzo Vecchio. It's all wrong. Is it? It's wrong only if you want it to be perspectival. If you understand the order as being processional, it's not a problem. What you're looking at here is a city recognized by a sequence of buildings, pretty much like the drawings we saw earlier on with the paint. They're incidental, they're moments. It's not about necessarily a sequence, albeit the procession is sequential. It's almost like a bag of buildings. And inside the city, it works in this way. So it's slightly different. If it's a view from the north, it's not even the Arno. So my argument is this is not a random arrangement. It's actually a representation of the most significant buildings in the city that were passed on the feast of San Giovanni along the Roman boundary. So they pass all of these buildings as a part of this process. Okay, so I'm going to shift on to another representation now, and that's happening in this church here called Santa Trinita, and it's the Sassetti Chapel. About 80 years, it's between the two representations we've looked at already, but it's still very clearly looking at these presentations. What do we know about Santa Trinita? Well, here's an interesting notion. Francesco Sassetti had a chapel in Santa Maria Novella, which is a Dominican church, and he was going to do his Franciscan because he liked France. St. Francis had the same name. So he was going to do a chapel to St. Francis in the Dominican. Now, either he lost money or the Dominicans didn't want it, so he sold that and decided he'd do one in this chapel. Is that a step down? Yes, I think probably. And the argument here is that what I did was I mapped all of the chapels, all of the families who paid for chapels in Santa Maria Novella, and you can see they're pretty much across the city. Here, with Santa Trinita, apart from Sassetti's family wife, who got the look in, they're all pretty local. So it means what we can begin to establish, and we know Santa Maria Novella was more important. The chapter house was used for the Council of Ferrara and Florence. It had many more bequests. But it's interesting, this is another way of looking at it. So here's the chapel itself in the church. The church was founded much earlier, but the chapel itself was around 1480 to 1485. This is it here. This is the outside of it with this image of Augustus again, with the Sibyl giving a prophetizing, is that the right word? The foundation of Florence. So these are the sorts of analysis I was doing of these paintings. Here we have David, who's obviously a symbol of both as a prophet, but also a civic symbol for Florence. The very famous Michelangelo sculpture was outside the Palazzo Vecchio and becomes a part of that processional order of the city. And here's Caesar Augustus, and it's very clear from various elements here, Trajan's column, that this is Rome. So that's authentic city selling us what we're doing. Inside the chapel itself, David was up here. What we were just looking at was above here. You have this particular arrangement. So it's 6 scenes from the life of St. Francis. Renounces his worldly goods, the confirmation of the rule, before the Sultan, stigmatization, funeral, and the posthumous resurrection of the notary's son, one of his miracles. But if you look at the chapel in detail, what we also have is landscapes, because they're not necessarily in temporal order, but what they are is landscapes on this side, city squares in the middle, and rooms on this side. So there's a sense of spatial change. And through the center, there is a set of themes dominated by infant boys. So the top, we have the children of the Medici emerging behind Poliziano, and Poliziano was the man who discovered this Liber Collinarum, which was the book that said that the triumviri had described it. So they were interested in that because it was a republican foundation rather than a dictatorial one. So Poliziano is a key scholar at the period. This one is the death of the notary's son, very clearly Florence, with Santa Trinita in the background. We'll come to that later. And then this one at the bottom here, which is, again, we'll come into those. So we can look at those three. Critically, Sassetti is here, and at the end here, and with Lorenzo de' Medici only 5 years after the Pazzi conspiracy where his brother was killed. So it's, again, extraordinarily political period in which to be painting such a painting. One of his early sketches, the final one. Here, more of a room. Here, much more ambiguous. It's a room. Is it Rome? Is it Florence? It's certainly got Florentine buildings in it. We have here the Loggia del Signoria, which is here, Palazzo Vecchio, which is here. But we also have this thing here, which is a remnant of this structure here, which feels a little bit more like Rome. The confirmation of Francis happened in Rome, but has been transferred here. And what we are doing is mirroring this procession of these guys up towards the Medici, and the same way that Francis is raising his, is moving towards the Pope. So there's these sort of civic order mirroring the religious order behind within this room or landscape that's working in that way. Here is, again, this sort of, a procession. Here we can see a procession actually coming out of Santa Trinita, but this is almost like a pause in a funeral procession. There's a dynamic movement towards it. In the background, you probably can't see, but this is the boy falling out of a window. Again, it happened elsewhere, and this is his resurrection. And there's many writers who think it's actually Sassetti talking about his own son who died in Lyon while he was a banker in Lyon, which is important for this painting because there's several questions about where the cities are. We can see this is the most obvious one of the procession of the Magi here, approaching to overtake or to take precedence or to get rid of the shepherds who are currently adoring Christ, the infant Christ, below a canopy. Again, there's some real life characters here I'm not going to go into in detail, but we can see it's definitely the Magi coming in here. And that's important because the Medici had a very strong influence or relationship with the Feast of the Magi, which we can see in the Gozzoli Chapel. But that's another lecture. But if we look at the houses, so everyone says this is Jerusalem, which is fine. I'm sort of by that one, the Dome of the Rock. It's in distance across some water. This one's more ambiguous. It's called Rome, but we've already seen in some of the other pictures that Florence is seeing itself as Rome in certain areas. So why would Rome have a picture in this? And they cite this particular Piero del Masaio's image or map with something like the Torah Militia, which is here as being a critical part of it. But this is, for me, much more interesting. This is from 1700, but around the time that the painting was finished, Lyon Cathedral was just completed. And this is where his son had died. And so if we look at here, there's no building in that map that looks anything like that. So the sense that this is probably more about Sassetti's own story, the death of his own child and the resurrection of his own child, becomes a part of this story, linked to a procession of people paying their respects. So what does that mean? It means that in this case, in around the end of the 15th century, we have a spatial order made up of landscapes, cities, rooms, and squares, traversed by characters in the painting. Most of them are moving. Contemporary figures who take part in the contemporary processions, which commemorate sacred and civic events, history, mimetically. So there's a recognition in the paintings of what's happening in the processions. The processions are a remaking of the landscape through a processional order. And that's what these paintings are trying to represent. They're not necessarily literal representations. They're trying to represent that depth of structure. So back in Palazzo Vecchio for one last excursion into the world of representation of Florence before we move back to London. So we've already mentioned that the Vasari was painting the ceiling for the Sala del Cinquecento, but he was also converting the whole of this palace into a palace for the Duke, who actually wanted to live in the Pitti Palace over here. So he built this secret corridor, which is fantastic. If you've never been, it's a highly recommended journey. You start in the Uffizi, and then you just go through this little door, and then you end up going through this thing across the upper level of the Ponte Vecchio and through here. So that even though he was spending all his time in the nice gardens and the bobbly gardens and coming out right next to the grotto where we have the Michelangelo sculptures of the slaves, beautiful place, he can also get nipped back over here. And he didn't nip back over there. He was carried on a litter. He was too fat. So they actually had 4 guys carrying him through this long corridor so he could wave out of the window at civic events when he needed to. And this, obviously, his health wasn't great, so this is his funeral. And what's interesting about it is that it links, he starts here, he's then carried past the key civic building. So here's the Bargello, comes past the prison, across this new bridge, relatively new bridge, goes past his palace. So he is recognizing his palace now. Back across the Santa Trinita, past, we've just seen this church here. Back on the foundation route, the Roman foundation wall. He could have cut across at this point, but no, it's recognizing this historic order. Up through, touching the baptistry and the cathedral before it then goes up towards the Medici Palace here, the palace they lived in prior to becoming the dukes, back in and then into San Lorenzo, where, of course, we have the Medici Chapel. So in this secret linking, he also did have very nice apartment in here, but it wasn't purely to his liking. But he also had one for his Eleanor. And in one of the rooms, this room here, the room of the Guaralda, we have paintings of the feasts, and it's the only thing, and it's again around about 1560, so it's very close to the period of this London image we're looking at. Guaralda was a Florentine woman who refused to kiss Otto IV on his visit. So she was a representation of virtue. So the room itself has a theme of virtue within which the images of the civic processions are placed. And this is not a coincidence. This means that we're talking about also a notion of civic virtue being represented through the activity associated with the processions. There are the festivals. So these are the 2 simplest ones. They're just almost just depictions with a loggia here by the Ponte Trinita. So the church, Santa Trinita, is just up here. And this is the old Mercato Vecchio, which was effectively on the site of the old Roman Forum. Those 2 feel like they could be any time. These other ones are a little bit more specific. So the ones we've just seen are this one here, Ponte Trinita, and the Forum, the old Forum, the Mercato Vecchio. We're just going to have a quick look at the others. So here's one. You probably recognize this by now. So this is not that dissimilar a view from the confirmation of the rule. Here's the loggia, Palazzo Vecchio here. We can see draped with fantastic, in fact, large drapery. These are the omaggi, these very detailed firework-like floats that were a part of quite a few of the festivals, banned by Savonarola at certain points for being too much fun. But you can see the perspective's not great, is it? You know, if we compare with what we were looking at with Vasari, it's an elevated view. You know, we're not really convinced about that being the Uffizi, are we? You know, it's not focused on architectural accuracy. We can certainly say that. And here, Piazza Santa Croce, before the facade was added, many may not know, but it was a 19th century facade that's on Santa Croce. And the Piazza Antonelli, which is here, Baroque facade was added onto these various different things. And this is a jousting going on, part of the jousting games. And of course, many of these things were revived by the fascists later on. I'm not going to go massively into that at all, but nevertheless, they were traditionally a part of these festives. This is it's not really a piazza, it's just a widening of the road outside the Palazzo Medici. You can see here that Michelangelo's windows already in, so it's already after his adaptation, with, again, these draperies outside and the seats on the front being used as a part of the celebration. So things you probably thought were seats were actually a part of this festive activity, the way in which the street could be used. This is the jousting of the Saracen, where they hit this thing and they have to get out the way before it spins and knocks them off their horse. And here, actually, again, an actual procession coming back into the baptistry with some sort of fun theatrical thing going on here. I mean, it's plus trades also going on. These things they're multifaceted. This is in Santo Spirito, so this is articulating that there was stuff going on south of the river, even if the procession didn't hit all of the quartieri, again without the facade. And then finally, Santa Maria Novella with the Calcio Storico, which still goes on now in the other piazza in Santa Croce, where 15 guys with pretty much no rules at all beat themselves up for about half an hour. Great fun to watch, actually. And that's based around the 4 quartieri fighting semi-finals and then having a final match on the feast day itself of San Giovanni. So there they are, spread out all over the city. And that brings us back. So finally, we get back to London. But hopefully on that journey, now you might look at this in slightly different way. We might understand it slightly differently because we've seen what we consider to be these fantastically perspectively accurate and understanding of the deep scholarship of the Renaissance. Here in the outskirts of civilization in London, something similar was going on. So what have we got? And we need to have a little bit more look at this. So we know the king's here. We know that the guy who commissioned the paintings here. But we also know that actually London really doesn't look like that. But if you take the center of the painting, it's almost, you could say, well, that's one perspectival grade, isn't it? Almost, that's one register of that. And that central section is Cheapside. So if we look back at the procession that's coming out, all of this stuff up to here is from there to there. From here to here is this bit. And from here all the way to Westminster is the rest. So there's the procession. If we just put the wall in for a moment to give you a little bit of guidance of where we are. We're back in the walled territory. So what do we know from the Florentine stuff? And the same is true for Coventry, for example, in this country, and also Salisbury, that these big church processions did go through all the city wards. And that sometimes when the processions predated the wards. The wards were built around in the same way that they were in Florence. But here we know that only 14 out of 25 of the wards were crossed. And this again comes back to Tony Travis's comments about it's difficult enough to get these guys talking to each other most of the time, and they're certainly not going to be organizing everything together. But what you can do when the king comes through is you can order some of them. And maybe they could have been a little bit more, obvious about where they wanted to go, but maybe these were slightly poorer and not so interesting for the king to go through. Maybe they're a bit more dangerous. We don't know. I don't know. This is an early part of the research for me, if you like. It's testing it out on you. But the question of whether certain areas are more Protestant or Catholic may also be a part of why these were. Having said that, Mary did follow the same course. And there is Cheapside. So the focus of the painting is that section of the thing. So we can either say it doesn't mean anything, or we could say maybe it does. And we remember that this section was also represented by men with the backs to us, who were in the report there, the guild members, the priests, the various, effectively, the institutions. So they were representing the institutions of the city, and they were gathered around Cheapside. Not either side, they were sort of ambling around, walking away. But equally, let's have a look at the buildings, because we've got that painting in Florence where there was a bag of buildings. Remember that one? So if we look, this is the Agas map, which is a fantastic resource online. It's just amazing. You could just spend hours looking at it. It's just beautiful. Here's a close-up. Here we are, Bow Church, St Mary le Bow, which is here on this side. This is the current map you can buy of Tudor London, and this is the only other building on Cheapside that has some sort of thing. But we can recognise the conduit and the cross, but this building seems to be on the other side. Does it look like this one? Possibly. Do we care? I mean, we could look and say, well, we don't know, but this map is very close in time. There's certainly nothing in front of the church that would suggest it's being hidden by such a large building. But does it matter that it's actually been shifted from one side of the street to the other? My argument would be no, it doesn't actually matter. In the same way that all of these men mixed priests and guild members. It said, remember, the guild were on one side of the road and the priests were on the other side with their incense and stuff. They're all on the same side here. So the fact that they're shifting things from the side to side is not naivety, is my argument. It's not naivety, it's very conscious. And it's about the way that the city was understood as being made by the procession of the king. It's, in a sense, you could argue the king's triumph is not in anything else but actually remaking the city through the painting itself. So these are in the right situation, relationship to each other, but they look like they've been put on the same side. So if we use the same language that we looked at earlier on, landscapes, cities and squares traversed by the characters in the painting, contemporary figures who take part in contemporary processions, which commemorate sacred and civic history mimetically. So in this sense, he is mimicking his father's progresses through the city. It's an established route through Cheapside. And places adapted for relevant stories like characters. I think that's the key, really. The places are adapted in the same way that characters are adapted. The procession, the order of the procession is more important than the perspectival ordering. That's the argument I think I've come to after looking at processions for the length of time I've looked at them. And what it means is that you can have Tony Travis's map of very strict ordering, but you can also have other people coming on and giving a poetic reading of it and changing the landscape periodically, and that they will be quite happy with that as long as it goes back to normal afterwards. Well, if that isn't the definition of a festival, I don't know what is. Okay, so there's but there's just before we go, there's very little time, much more to say, but just to say a little bit about what this means, the canopy. So the canopy is an important part of the iconography of kingship, divine kingship. And this is from the Corpus Christi procession of 1408 in Salisbury, where we can see the canopy covers the monstrance, which has the consecrated Eucharist inside. Most cities had one Corpus Christi. It became a part of the church processional order around the beginning of the 14th century, was reiterated around the middle of the 14th century, and it became one of the ways in which they tried to make parishes, which in urban areas had their own rituals, into something that represented the city, something like we saw with the Feast of San Giovanni in Florence. In Britain, we didn't really have that, particularly after the Reformation. It became incredibly difficult. We know that Edward VI actually sanctioned, he did allow to have some processions to stay, which were about beating the bounds, the notion of these peripheral circumnavigation of parishes, annual circumnavigation in order to establish the order. So he was in favour of them, but in London, they weren't very good at this for exactly the reason that Tony Trevor says. So if we read Mary Rubin on Corpus Christi, which is the best work on it, London never developed a town-wide celebration for the feast, a project which is almost unthinkable in so large and varied a city, but rather had a series of processions related to parish churches, fraternities, crafts. The Skinners of London, this is their procession here, organised a great play on the Corpus Christi, which was described by the Great Chronicle in 1408, and which was said to have lasted from Wednesday to Friday. And with more celebrations on Sunday, described by Lydgate as the procession of the Feast of Corpus Christi made in London. So you had Corpus Christi processions and theatrical productions, often different times. But what you can see here is how limited. My guess is they would have gone here to St. Paul's, and that would have been the journey. Whereas in York, there's one journey for the whole city that does that towards the York Minster. In London, I reckon probably, I mean, there could have been hundreds. The reason why we've got the Skinners is because there's surviving documentation of that. Many of the other guilds would have lost that documentation of what exactly that was like. But it's very likely that the Wednesday to Sunday was probably them having to get quite a few of these in from all these different guys in order to then have a celebration at the end. So you can see how something like the Lord Mayor or the King having one thing going through London would have been one of the only moments when the city actually saw itself as a unified element, where wine being given for free in the conduits along the route, which are mentioned in the celebrations, are a part of the celebration of the whole city. So in that sense, it's the monarchy, as one would expect, in the constitution of the United England at the time, that was the way in which it was unified. England, so here's the Queen Elizabeth from her own progresses, again with this canopy above. So the question is, what are they doing here? It's more about the king's two bodies, the notion of the divine kingship and the political kingship. What the canopy does is it accentuates this divine side to it. It's not, many people have written about these processions or these progresses as being political. Propaganda, I think, is the word that's used. And I don't see them necessarily as propaganda. I think they're almost, why wouldn't Elizabeth do this? She has to do it because it's a part of who she is as a queen. It's not like everything is political. There are other motivations for doing things. And sometimes our later modernist thinking imposes these sorts of orders. So here we are then, back in here. The processional framework of the painting allows a distortion of the city, prioritizing the central districts. Landmarks signify different stages of the journey. Prince Edward in the center of the procession, below a canopy, indicating divine kingship. Institutions of the city represented by people rather than guild or church buildings. And buildings dressed for the occasion. hierarchies represented through the procession itself. This is a sophisticated, not a perspectival order based around procession. You won't find Wally in here. It's really sophisticated. And what's interesting is if we map, just as a final image really, if we look at, it's two images, if we look at the current Lord Mayor City procession, this is Cheapside. So Cheapside still has a very, very significant part. When we look at the original processions by the Lord Mayor after inauguration, they come down to the river, they get off at St Paul's Dock, go up to Westminster, get conferred by the King, come back to St Paul's Dock, come up, go to the Guildhall, which is up here. Then they come back down. Sorry, it's up. Yes, it is around here, isn't it? There, I think. So Cheapside was a significant part of the procession, both to the Guildhall and then from the Guildhall back to St Paul's for Mass. And we have in the contemporary session them still using Cheapside as a part of it, albeit the rest of it is around the legal system, around the Temple area of London here. So the final slide. So my question is, okay, we've got all of this stuff. We had it. There was a representation of it. In Florence, this is an image from Florence on the Feast of San Giovanni in the courtyard, in Michelozzo Court at the Palazzo Vecchio, waiting for the mayor, having picked up the candles, the gift of the candles, from the candle area up in the north of the city. They've processed down. There's a whole pile of flag wavers, drummers outside, and these guys are waiting in here, and I walk in. Anyone can walk in, no barriers. Anyone can take a photograph, walk in. The architect's threshold, the threshold of the building, coming back to Janus, the boundaries and thresholds that were made in the 14th and 15th century still work. Here's the loggia here. And you can still sense the civic grandeur, the civic nature of these processions. My question is whether we still feel the same about the Lord Mayor's show. Does it have that same sense of gravitas that many of the people, even the footballers who are beating each other up, feel for this event? And that's really the question at the end. So it's a bit of a long story around, but hopefully giving you an idea of why England was at the time as sophisticated, I think, as Florence, but just manifested it in a slightly different way. That's it.
So, thank you, Christian. Brilliant. And I think I'm going to be the roving mic, so asking for questions. What's next?
I'm not sure. I mean, I've been interested in coming back to London. The most recent work I've done is on Coventry, which is one of the ways in which I understood, because the previous work on Salisbury began my interest in processions, and the work I've done in my most recent book begins to take it through the notion of civic, the early civic structures of the communes in Italy. And I think bringing it to Coventry during the same sort of period was an interesting first stab at that. And I've done a similar mapping of Coventry and established the probable relationship of the morning church procession to the afternoon theatrics, because of course Coventry's known for its theatrical mystery plays and stuff which are very famous. London is a tricky one because of exactly the conversation that Tony said, that it's a very different European city because of this world. So I think that's why the urban structure by the king or the queen's coronation is one of those only moments. Whether I take that next into more depth, I'm not 100% sure. I think it could, I'm just conscious of how much work in order to do that mapping properly to understand why, for example, it did take that route. One would have to do. I was just telling you the route it was, and I can't tell you why. To get to that stage, which is what I could do with the Florence one, I'm not sure London will offer that.
I think though, just before we open it up further, there is the coronation route, which does bind the two cities of Westminster and the city, and we have looked at Fleet Street, for instance, for various reasons, and I think there's a very rich, take your word, tapestry of events that occur along that route, which would be worth looking at along with the Lord Mayor's progression. But they're still there, and they're still kind of very rich.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. And actually, what I was going to ask leads directly on from what Eric was saying. It was the canopy, actually. And I think we all remember the most recent coronation and that weird moment where, our king disappeared behind, he had to sort of undergo some ceremonies that had to be hidden and so on. So I think, the sacredness of, to the extent that one actually believes in it, the sacredness of the monarchy still weirdly exists in ritual, probably more, I would say, than any other element of our public ritual. And then I was going to refer directly to, as Eric said, this sort of, I think what's unique in London is that because the city was so powerful financially and Westminster's upstream critically, which is a weak place to be because they couldn't exert power because power rested with trade, whether you have, and if you haven't, maybe you might, traced the sort of the roots as they've evolved over time. And my original question was going to be, whether there's a rupture at some point when, interestingly, Cheapside is no longer the centre of the procession, because Cheapside, of course, was the centre of the trade in the City of London. So it was just that whole set of things that I find really fascinating.
It's difficult to know exactly. I think what the very large print shows is that, in fact, once you come out of the city, there is really only one route to Westminster, past Charing Cross, which is where Trafalgar Square was, and then down to Westminster along. And there weren't any other alternative routes. So I think they were going effectively forward and back. The big thing is how they come in through the gate just past Fleet Street and then get down to the Tower of London. And at what point do they ziggy-zaggy down from that thing? Do they go through the end? And when I first thought they would have almost gone all the way through and come down the other side. But when I started looking at it and listening to what was happening, you get this much more convoluted little ziggy-zaggy route. But in terms of what's going on, the main events seem to happen when we get at least past the first zigzag, the first zig of the zag, if you like, and then across, and then all the way down. So it lists various pageants that are going on all the way down, and it's very similar for all of them. I think for me the critical thing was the Reformation. The Reformation got rid of anything that was papistic, and therefore most of things like the Corpus Christi processions would have been suppressed. They weren't, if they could argue, and this is the decree of Edward VI, if they could argue that they were sort of parish-based boundary, tracking someone's boundaries. If you're doing the city's boundaries, that's all right. You can do that. What you can't do is something that's a little bit more linear and not doing that. So he allowed circumnavigations, it appears, from the text, but not linear ones. So it's a slightly strange, but he was in favour of them, clearly. He loved them. He was happy to march through the city with all these hundreds of people. Either so, when he was a bit young, wasn't he? So he didn't really have a choice. But yeah.
Great talk, Christian. One of the interesting things about these processions is the sort of the hinterland that they each have. You know, if you think of the palio, you think of the horses being blessed in kind of local churches. In Moscow, the giant square next to Gum is used to prepare for the giant procession in Red Square adjacent. In London, for the Lord Mayor's show, London Wall on that morning and Aldersgate, they're completely taken up with, brownies and, Indian bagpipers and just a wonderful selection of people. So there's an entire sort of hinterland that's part of, the very specific route of the procession. And I wonder if there's anything you found out about the hinterland of the Lord Mayor's show or the procession that you're talking about that's somehow interesting and part of your thesis.
I think they're each procession has a slightly different. They're like characters, I think. So each city has a slightly different character of it. They take ownership of it in the same way that a mayor under a different jurisdiction, might do something different. So one's talking about several things. One's talking about the flattening of it into something that is regularly performed in exactly the same way, or a broad frame in which things can happen around it. And so I think there are moments, for example, when the Calcio Storico in Florence took place in different squares in the city. And in certain areas, certain times, I think it's even taken place in Fiorentina's stadium. But if it's in there, it's just entertainment. It doesn't have a civic feel to it. It's a bit like, the difference between a flash mob in a railway station that has some sort of civic presence and in a shopping mall. A flash mob in a shopping mall just feels like a couple of people dancing. It doesn't have, so the architecture itself is a part of that hinterland. It's also about that backup. But I think one of the key things in answer to your question, I think, is probably that when I start doing this and I start talking to various different historians about the various ways, what they often want to do is ask questions about ownership. Who owns the festival? And throughout history, what you realize is people have tried to take it over, take various ones over. So the Medici tried to take over the festival, the Feast of the Magi procession, and then Savonarola just, slapped them back at some point. And the feasts themselves, the processions themselves, have a resistance to that sort of co-opting. And that background, the hinterland that you're talking about, is very all-encompassing, very inclusive often. So just because, for example, it's a Christian procession, doesn't mean that other denominations, other religions weren't a part of it. And I think in the last talk that I gave for Eric's, I read a long quotation from Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet of a description of a feast, which was a Christian feast of St. Miriam that ended with the chanting of Allah, Allah, Allah by the various people. So the hinterland, I think, changes consistently. And that's, in a sense, having the civic nature of it, the institutional nature of it embodied in the people as much as the architecture, is what makes it work. And I suppose my question in relation to the London one is it trying hard enough with that hinterland? That's my question, I think.
What an amazing lecture to hear on the day of the Archbishop of Canterbury's kind of inauguration, and the fact that she walked from Cheapside, from Thomas à Becket's home on Cheapside, on a pilgrimage or procession to Canterbury. And I think that's something quite... And I kind of question, because my question is about Eleanor's crosses and that procession that, King Edward I took from the death of his wife, that was also a pilgrimage from Rutland down, and the Cheapside Cross is one and the Charing Cross is one. And how much do we believe that the procession, and you go to a lot of the Greek you know, churches, and you have the saints and the processions that take through the Greek Orthodoxy to, you know, St. Spiridon's and Corfu and places like this. How much is the procession, the pilgrimage related, do we think? And how much do we think that these processions and pilgrimages and religion is part of that?
I think they're very similar. And in fact, if you read my book, uh, um, the notion of a lot of the work of anthropologists on pilgrimage actually cover the same type of experience. So, for example, if you Victor Turner talks about 3 levels of engagement with a festival or a pilgrimage. One is separation, which is when you're watching it, but it's not watching, you're separated. So it's witnessing it. It's very different. You're not just a spectator. Just by watching it, you're at least engaged with it as a witness is with an act. Someone who's actually in it is incorporated. And then there's this other thing in between, which is called transition. And I think what happened was that a lot of anthropologists talked about pilgrimage as being thresholds in terms of the time in which, so you might have a ritual of separation, a ritual of transition. But what they realized was things like pilgrimage and procession and festivals actually incorporate all of those things. I think what's very interesting about these ones, because it's post-Reformation and having to be civic, and in Florence, because in fact the ones that Savonarola banned were the ones that had become the most civic, when in fact after the Reformation, it's in the country it's the other way round. That relationship to how you make that type of relationship with the divine civic is interesting. And I think that's really where the procession and the festival works, because what it does is through the experience itself, it makes that happen. And so that's why the processions are really important. They're not, they're not rituals in the same way that a mass is a ritual. And in fact, even if you go to Florence tonight, you say, you ask about the procession, they say, do you mean the parade or the procession? They're two different things. And so that distinction, I think, is again a part of your question. And pilgrimage is a very important part of it. And festivals, which are, of course, pilgrimages tend to be outside cities. Festivals tend to be inside the cities, but they're the same thing. Sorry, long answer.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just, obviously I've seen a lot of these photographs of Florence, which was completely central in your PhD work, but there was this theme that you addressed quite strongly, which you haven't addressed so much in London, but about the way the festivals make this time, which is outside of the formal time, and notwithstanding the restating of kingship and so forth, it's also this moment which is a little bit rowdy and a little bit unpredictable. And just thinking about London and the, if you like, the capacity for London to also, as not just a European city, but a world city, to convene countercultures and other forms of celebration or ritual which are not selecting this specific prioritized piece of city, but parts of the city which are obscured. I'm thinking also of, counterculture, counterspace, the firm run by Sumaya Valley, who was the youngest architect to design the Serpentine Pavilion. She created in that Serpentine Commission a series of satellite relationships, and pieces of the pavilion then went out to these locations, and she created new processional routes to those situations to say the procession can reveal parts of the city that are not prioritized. So that was a very kind of intentional way of prioritizing the concealed or the counterculture through the festival, creating this alternative time and space. Do you foresee in London the capacity of these festivals to renew London in ways that open up that counterculture more, or rather than reaffirming the prioritized order?
Okay, I think there was about 3 questions in there. it is true that festivals have a time out of time that is about the performance of the festival, and that links a little bit to what I was answering with Alex's question. And that also comes down to the images of kings imitating real kings, or the theatrical nature of it, in a way that we can find even as late as the Baroque in terms of that type of representation. So the time out of time aspect of it, I haven't talked about, but that is in a sense a part of, albeit it's a singular coronation procession, it is linking with other coronation processions, and therefore it is one of many, and therefore links to the divine in one could argue in that sense. I think the invention of processions is dangerous. Not dangerous, difficult. I think it's a bit like at an architectural school, you get students all the time saying, what's this space? It's going to be a market. And you know how difficult markets are to make really work. And the same thing goes for real processions. I'm sure you could make the processions that the architect, you just said, did during that time. The question is really, will it repeat? That's the question. And I think one of the interesting things about the Italian example is that you can trace back the activity right the way back to the 13th century of the processions. And albeit they were intermittently performed, the last one, for example, of the Calcio Storico and the last procession was done before the fascist revival, was in around the turn of the century. They certainly did it when Italy was unified, and they did another one in the early part of the 20th century, perhaps 1906, I think. But what Mussolini was very good at was picking out the stuff that was already nascent in the city. It was already present. And the festivals that work the best do that. That in a sense, I characterized it I ran a conference on it, and we split the papers up into three. One of them was the festival in history. So we had very specific ones that happened at various points in history that were massively written about, and thousands of pounds were spent on them. Then there were the new ones, which was like the new festivals. And the most successful ones were called the festivals through history, that they were the ones that adapted and managed to find their way. And they have within them counterculture. So I would argue, if one wants to talk about counterculture, would be to look at these types of events historically and build off those. So in Salisbury, for example, they haven't done it, but they've got the mayor comes out, and they've got the dragon, and comes out on St. George's Day. And they used to have a dragon in the regation processions, which was the historical thing. But currently it just sort of goes around the town hall, and it looks like a bit of a joke. But actually, it could be a really extraordinary thing that could bring the city together. And there's enough information for them to build that, including a music festival that, instead of happening 3 miles to the north on the same day as St. George's Day, could have happened in the close. And you then get that. So I think the counterculture requires both the institutions of the city as well as other people to get together and to say, what is it we want this to be? And recognizing, as sort of Mussolini had to in the end, that you can't make it purely fascist, that along with it comes a resistance to fascism. The counterculture in all festivals is implicit. And therefore, you can't control it.
Hi, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you. I was just thinking, just with reference to the coronation and to, as we mentioned, King Charles, whose coronation a couple of years ago, but just how that the philosophy behind that, the treatment you were mentioning about the, just the presentation and the ritual, but how it was very much based on the Japanese emperor's coronation. And some of the methodology and the thinking behind that, and I'm just sort of intrigued to think how that could have one thinks about the Catholic Church, one thinks about the British Church, but then also to kind of look at what's perhaps Shinto, but also perhaps another Eastern philosophy, and just how that methodology has sort of, compared to Edward VI, now here we are.
I think I'd probably look at it,
Yeah.
I'd turn that the other way up.
Okay.
And I would say that one of the most amazing things about going to, is recognizing how international tourists understand the civic nature of what's going on. And that's because they have their own civic performances, their own civic processions. So you intrinsically recognize when something is playing with that depth of field. Whether in fact they were mimicking, I haven't heard that they were mimicking.
Perhaps not mimicking, but certainly adapted. It had sort of adapted the idea of the procession with regard to.
Okay, but then there's plenty of stuff in there, and it may well be that there was actually quite a lot of overlap in terms of similarity.
There probably was, yeah.
And it's that civic nature, and also the fact that if you're trying to anoint a king, then there are only a certain number of things that you can do, and some of it has to be in private. So.
Yes, exactly.
I'm going to draw it to a close, if I may. So, Christian, thank you massively. We can continue the conversation over to my right. And, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.